Good day to everyone. I hope everything is good with everyone watching. We're going to just quickly kind of recapitulate what I was talking about the other day with the attribution issues. Origen seems to have a really important place in this whole argument over whether Josephus mentioned Jesus or not, or James, the brother of Jesus, and therefore Jesus, who was the Christ. So I'm just going to retell that story because I think I might have left out a couple of things, and I think it's extremely important because it is one of the only other kind of constituent pieces of evidence that Josephus might have mentioned James, the brother of Jesus. And it looks as though he didn't, and it looks as though he never saw that passage, and that it was a later interpolation into Josephus after the fact. We know not when. I think it probably is likely that it came with Eusebius exactly around the time that we find Eusebius for the first time mentioning the Testimonium Flavianum, which is absolutely, as far as I'm concerned, 100% a forgery. And people like Thomas Schmidt have not done a good job in, I think, for the last time trying to revive it, and indeed doing an important piece of work, but not overriding and not beating the skeptical approach here of really looking at the non-attestations of the Testimonium for the first 200 odd years of its life, apparently. And all of the problems around it with the discourse style in the Testimonium, and the fact that that Josephus just doesn't use that kind of wording anywhere in his works, and we already know it's partially interpolated. That we can be absolutely sure about, not for the least because Origen tells us that Josephus didn't think that Jesus was the Messiah. It is said, though, this is important, that the very reason he says that would hearken to some kind of mention of Jesus by Josephus. However, it looks as though he's just taken Hegesippus's work, and from there we just misremembered a quote, a series of quotes maybe in Hegesippus. We garner now through Eusebius, who quotes Hegesippus in small kind of fragments, and that Origen just has not seen either the Testimonium, never mentions it, never references it, never talks about anything in it, or this little James quote, the second quote, which basically just has Jesus, who was the Messiah, who was the Christ. So there's about 3 small words in Greek. What that people like myself and Richard Carrier believe is simply another Jesus within the James passage that's more likely to be the brother here of another James, not really related to James the Just or any brother of Jesus, who is totally unattested in the first century anywhere else. Even the Dead Sea Scrolls don't name or don't mention a James, as far as my research has informed me. Anyway, Origen refers 3 times in his surviving works to a passage about James, the brother of Jesus, supposedly found in the works of Flavius Josephus. However, upon close inspection, the content he describes does not match the extant passage found in Antiquities 2200. Furthermore, he appears to attribute theological and moral sentiments to Josephus that are more in line with Christian hagiography than with Josephus's known works. This has led many scholars to conclude that Origen either misremembered the source, was using a corrupted text, or most likely was actually confusing the works of Hegesippus with those of Josephus. Okay, Origen's reference to Josephus on James, a commentary of Matthew. This is one of the places it's found, 10:17. And so great a reputation among the people for righteousness did this James rise, that Flavius Josephus, who wrote the Antiquities of the Jews in 20 books, so he can't actually find this quote now. It seems as though he doesn't know where it is. He does quote this same chapter that we now find in 18, the testimonium in, but he's talking about he's talking about John the Baptist, which is quite interesting. So he does reference the same book in 18, but he never talks about the testimonium. He's only referencing that portion of Josephus that talks about John the Baptist. Which is interesting. We wish to examine the cause of why people suffered so great misfortune that even the temple was razed to the ground. Said that these things befell them in accordance with the wrath of God in consequence of what they had dared to do against James, the brother of Jesus, who was called the Christ. So he does say that. This is not found in any version of Josephus we possess. It is in Hegesippus, by the way. And again, against Celsus against Celsus here, another quote by Origen. This James, who was known as the brother of Jesus, who was called the Christ, and whom Josephus, who wrote the Jewish Antiquities, mentions in his writing as having been put to death by the Jews, although he did not accept Jesus as Christ. Okay, which is not what we find in the James quote. Again, this wording is absent from the actual Antiquities 2200 commentary on Matthew again. And we find Origen saying 3055. And the wonderful thing is that though he did not accept Jesus as the Christ, he yet gave testimony that the righteousness of James was so great, which he never did, by the way, Josephus, and he says that people thought that they suffered these things because of James. Okay, Josephus never links James's death to divine punishment, nor praises his righteousness. The actual passage in Josephus Antiquities 2200 reads thusly, and this is a small kind of abridgment. So he, Ananus the high priest, assembled the Sanhedrin of judges and brought forth them the brother of James, who was called the Christ, whose name was James, and some others. So it's just informally just going through very quickly here what happened about Jesus ben Ananias. This priest Ananus. So it's just going through quickly. It doesn't really focus on James here. He's just mentioned in passing. When he had formed an accusation against them as breakers of the law, he delivered them to be stoned. Okay, this is the only passage in all of Josephus's works that references James, Jesus, and the term Christ. It is a dry legalistic account of a stoning under a high priest, Ananus, and lacks all of the theological interpretation Origen attributes to it. When Origen was Origen referring to Hegesippus? Hegesippus, a 2nd century Christian chronicler, wrote about James' martyrdom in dramatic and theological terms. His account, quoted by Eusebius, Ecclesiastical History 223, includes the following elements. James is portrayed as a holy and righteous man. He is thrown from the temple and then beaten to death, so different deaths, beaten with a fuller's club. There might be a little stoning there, but then he falls off the temple's roof, which is impossibly hard to survive because the temple was huge. You can go and check for yourself. His martyrdom is linked to divine punishment. The people blame the fall of Jerusalem on James's death, and the siege happens straight after this event, not 8 years after, which is a bit of time. We can all agree, I'm sure. Key quotes from Eusebius quoting Hegesippus: because of James the just, whom they had killed as a righteous man, Jerusalem suffered its fall. Okay, these things happened to James the just at the hands of the lawless men, the Jews. Anyway, and he was buried on the spot, and the pillar erected to his memory still stands by the temple. That doesn't exist. The notion that he would be buried on the spot in the temple grounds is totally un-Jewish. It was a sacred area. People were buried outside of the towns. This is not true. This man was a true witness to both Jews and Greeks that Jesus is the Christ. And immediately Vespasian besieged them. Immediately afterwards, not 8 years after the fact. I found out I thought it was 4. It's 8 years. Depending on how you cut the time of this event that Josephus talks about, the killing of James. These statements match almost exactly the theology Origen attributes to Josephus. Okay, scholarly opinion. Richard Carrier, Alice Wheely, Ken Olson, and many others argue that Origen confuses Hegesippus' account with Josephus, either from memory or from a Christian florilegium that merged or attributed sources. Okay. The fact that Origen never quotes Josephus' actual language and instead attributes Christian theological meaning to him strongly suggests a confusion or misattribution. And I just believe, as I think Carrier does, that he's just got all these texts in front of him and he thinks he remembers something differently than the way he actually read it. And this happens, and it did happen quite a few times to Origen. He misattributes quite often. I have a list of about 10 misattributions he makes, and some of them are quite glaring. He was prone to making mistakes sometimes. The actual Antiquities 2200 lacks all moral and theological interpretation and cannot have been the source of Origen's claim unless it had already been interpolated. Okay, this is no manuscript evidence that the passage Origen refers to ever existed in Josephus. And I put a little Bayesian analysis here. The result is 1 to 19 against the hypothesis that it actually comes from. I think that's right, yeah. Estimate. So I'll just read it here quickly. If Origen had read 2200, it is very unlikely he would misrepresent it so badly. Okay, if he is drawing from Hegesippus, the evidence matches very well. So it's about a 95% probability here that he's actually reading from Hegesippus and certainly not Josephus. And just to conclude here, I'll wrap this up very shortly. It is extremely unlikely that Origen knew the James passage and Antiquities 2200 as we have it today. The content he refers to matches Hegesippus' account of Jesus' martyrdom much more closely and includes distinctively Christian theological elements that Josephus would not have endorsed. Origen never quotes the passage directly, and his wording cannot be reconciled with the known Josephus' text. Therefore, it is far more probable that Origen was confusing Hegesippus with Josephus rather than referencing a lost or authentic version of Josephus. Okay, I'll leave that there. Thank you. Oh, and by the way, if you want to go back to a video I made a few years ago on Hegesippus, I think I have it there in my kind of backlog of work, my catalogue. So please have a look if you want. Hegesippus' version of what happened to James is very likely just Christian storytelling. I'm afraid it doesn't exist anywhere but in his account, and it's wholly kind of strange and fantastical. Anyway, bye bye.